That whole southern Utah movement and culture started with a few people who were relentlessly dedicated, incredibly faithful, very loving, and really were committed to making this area and community spectacular. And she's one of those. She just absolutely is.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
It's so great today, this beautiful May Day in Utah's Dixie, to be sitting here with Sharla Brooks Moody and her brother Darren Brooks, two awesome people in their own right who are doing amazing things in this community. But they're the grandchildren of Juanita Brooks. And we get to talk about Juanita Brooks today. We get to maybe just start to scratch the surface of who she was, who she is, and what she means to this community and what she means to the world, because her life really transcended Dixie in so many ways. And I feel honored today to have Sharla and Darren here, to have a chance to visit with them, to talk about Juanita. And we could set this up with a bit of biography, but I think that biography will come out as we talk. But Juanita was born in 1898 in Bunkerville, Nevada. She was born on the edge of everything you can imagine. And she grew up really in the midst of that pioneer period, even though it was at the end of that pioneer period. But she bridged that period into the new century in amazing ways. And she grew up, we would have to say, poor, and poor in the sense that she didn't have much physically in her life, but she grew up rich in heritage and in that pioneer legacy, and rich in story. And I think that richness of story just is what propelled her right on through her amazing life. She's been called the most notable person to ever come from Dixie, and I think I believe that. Sharla, let's start with you. Maybe just share some of your thoughts about your Grandma Juanita.
Oh, it's so hard to put my thoughts into one small bit because I think she represented so many different things for different people. I think she had an uncanny ability to love all varieties, all colors, all types of people, and they knew that and they felt that. And so everybody, whether you appreciate all that she did, you felt from her acceptance. And she had this way of bridging the gap between the church and the dissenters. And she still, if you talk to people that feel their own sense of church rebellion, they relate to her. If you talk to people that are faithful, they relate to her. And all of them respect her ability to tell the truth. But the one thing that I love the most about her is her real life. She had some really funny, quirky stories. She was a mom, she was a grandma, she was a sister, and all of that represent a whole picture that it makes her even more endearing than her scholarly work to me.
And there's so much we can talk about here. And Sharla, as you shared that, it reminds me that really we're just setting the stage here for Juanita. We need to and we want to do a series of podcasts where we talk about all of these facets of her life with guests from the scholarly community, with folks from the community, and with just a lot of those people are no longer with us that we would love to have be here to talk about her. But we'll be able to do that. For those who maybe aren't familiar with Juanita Brooks, they need to know that she was a writer, a historian, a noted and award-winning and beloved scholar and writer, and a person who transcended the local color of Dixie and her name, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s, was known throughout the country, throughout the world, and still is. But there's many ways that Juanita has been remembered. One of them is the lecture series at the university here in St. George. And I had the chance to attend the Juanita Brooks lecture, the annual lecture this year. And it was so awesome because I hadn't seen Darren in a long time. And he got up and gave an introduction about his grandma that was just so powerful. But he did it in a way that I think just made her smile because he didn't do the regular biography. He just told some stories about her, which were awesome. And Darren, maybe you could recreate that introduction for us today.
Yeah, just hearing you talk and listening to Sharla, I think something that's really noted in her and her life was the frontier was full of faith back then. The people were really called and were required to live largely on faith. They'd already been really worked over, and their ancestors had been worked over with the church and with the pilgrimages across the plains, and then from Salt Lake to St. George and even beyond to Bunkerville. She was, to my knowledge, one of the first, if not the first, to blend all of that faith and heritage and hard work with really high-level education. That's, I think, one thing that's really spectacular about her is it wasn't enough for her to just say, oh, yeah, I believe, and we're going to work hard and trust the Lord, which she certainly said those things and lived her life that way. But she also had a very keen and really curious intellect. And I think that cracked some glass ceilings. I know that's cliche, but that really moved southern Utah really single-handedly on her shoulders, as a woman especially. A woman on the frontier had a certain place, right? It was a very hardworking, very amazing place, but it usually wasn't in the place of higher education. I don't know of anyone more educated than Juanita Brooks, male or female, during her years helping develop southern Utah and Mesquite, Bunkerville. So I think it's important as we talk about her as one of these tall trees that really did establish the area. It wasn't just blind faith. She added into this space the best minds in the country from Colombia. That's really rare for her to travel that far and bring that back into the desert and say, yeah, I agree with all of you. We do have a mission. We do love the Lord. Like, we are part of this Zion community. And all of that which she adored and she espoused until the day she died, she also brought back saying, but there's more. We can be smart. We can be intellectual. We can be philosophical. We can think with the rest of the world too. And I think watching the university and the high schools and education kind of bloom, really talking about her, I want to first start by acknowledging that shift from just faith, uneducated, hardworking, that shift into high-level education started with her, in my opinion.
And Darren, as you shared that, it struck me that there were aspects of her early life that were tragic, but the way for her to become who she became was a result of a lot of that tragedy, including the loss of her first husband. Right. And I don't know if you could maybe share with us, Sharla, when it came time, and I hope you'll share the Columbia story, because my grandpa is a big part of it, A.K. Hafen. But when that time came, she actually was able to go. Rather than being a mom with several children and a husband and all of that, she was in a position, albeit as the result of tragedy, that allowed her to move on to Columbia. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, and I love what Darren said. I think that there's a quote that is in her Levi Peterson book, the book about her by Levi Peterson, who said she was born into one of the greatest wealth of diaries anywhere at a time when it was all interesting. I'm not quoting it very well. I should find it. And she didn't see her life as anything except for really ordinary. She made all these really ordinary plans. She got married. Her husband was already sick. But she did everything in her expected way until everything went wrong. And
she became a widow in her early 20s?
She did. Her husband died on January 8th of 1921. So she was born in 1898 in January, and her birthday was on January 15th. So she would have been 22 and
she
with
had
a
one
4-month-old. Yep, he was born September 27th of 1920. So 4 months earlier.
What a great guy. We're all smiling. What an awesome fellow. In fact, when we started St. George Magazine in 1983, he submitted some stories to us, and they were great stories. And he had that same desire to tell stories, and that was really fun. But then, so that was in the early 20s, and then I think it was 1928 when that fateful faculty meeting occurred at the old Dixie campus.
Can we back up just a little
Yes,
bit?
you
One of my
bet.
favorite stories about her is that I think her parents must have seen something in her and all of their children, because a lot of parents back then only expected of their children what everybody else was doing and what was normal. But one of my favorite stories about her is printed in the foreword of her very first publication, which was The Life and Times of Dudley Levitt. That book actually came out in 1941, but that was the very first thing that was published. And in that foreword, she tells a little story, and she said, when I was 10 years old, my grandfather died. So her grandfather was Dudley Levitt. And upon his death, he lived 2 doors down from them in Bunkerville, and she would visit them every day. And upon his death, her dad handed her the family book, she called it, and he said, I want you to write about your grandfather. And I thought, at 10 years old, I have a granddaughter close to that age. Darren has a son close to that age. I can't imagine handing my grandchild the family book and saying, why don't you go ahead and write about your grandfather? And then he told her, he said, and when you're older, I want you to write the real story. And I thought, at 10 years old, what her parents had in mind was unique and unusual. Then you fast forward to her losing her husband. She went away to college. Her siblings and other people tended her child so she could go to school. And in 1928, when she was sitting around, she was the only woman in the room. They went around the room and they said, we have a sabbatical for someone to go to Columbia. And she was the newest faculty member. Went around the room to every single person, and they had some excuse of why they couldn't do it. And it got to her, and she said, don't offer it to me because I'll take it so fast it'll make your head spin. Thought, wow, that's really brave. And I love that story about her because she did, and she went.
I love it, too, because when she wrote it in Quicksand and Cactus, she mentions my grandpa. And the way she mentions him is in that same sense that I was talking about earlier. She said, near the close of the hour, President Nichols announced that the board had consented to give one sabbatical leave each year. This would enable a teacher to take a year off for study on half pay and come back with a raise in salary the following year. Brother, Arthur K. Hafen, had been longest in service here. Would he care to accept the offer? And his answer was, I couldn't possibly leave for a full year, Arthur K. said. My family is large. I cannot take them, and I cannot leave them. The older boys are at an age where it is hard for my wife to manage them. Those were my uncles, and I can imagine. And her health is poor. And then they go through the rest of the room, and your grandma's the last one that they come to. And then she said exactly what you said, Sharla. Don't look at me, I said. I'll take it so quick it'll make your head swim. And I've always thought 2 things about that. Number one, I'm almost grateful that my grandpa couldn't take it because he had the first chance at it. But I'm also grateful that Juanita could. Because the main reason that the rest of those couldn't is because of those family obligations and family commitments and family situations. She was at a point in her life where she could go from there to what her destiny would be. And she did all those things. She was a mother of many children, and all of that became part of her life. But everything was in the right place at that time for her to go to Columbia. And I don't know if we're putting too much emphasis on that, but to me, that had to have been huge because it allowed her to do what Darren was saying, to go out and then look back in.
to bring that back with her too. And she had such a sharp mind and took such careful notes. I can imagine her out there being the ultimate student, knowing that it was a massive privilege and she may never be there again. So she took advantage of that, I think, in ways that I wish I would have. I just took a lot of that for granted, but back then I don't think she did. I think when she walked onto that campus and that story about how she wondered and was nervous and afraid and heard the bells peal, Lead Kindly Light, which was her favorite hymn, she knew that she was supposed to be there. That not only had she taken the opportunity, but the Lord was with her too. And I think that meant a tremendous amount to her. So now, not only was she this rogue frontier woman striding across the campus of Columbia, but she knew that she had divine help with her during that space. And I'll bet you that she took full advantage of that, asking tremendous questions and really arguing when she felt like she wanted to. And when she came home really ready to hit her full stride with her mission, she knew not only that she had inspiration on her side, but she also now had this intellect that very few people did, and especially women did. So she further cemented this really unique space in the frontier for a woman well-educated and traditioned and bred all of those old sayings. And boy, was she respectable. I know that it's different, but Paul in the New Testament has all of these kind of unique things that allow him to be this incredible author and really relate on these really deep, interesting levels. And I like a little bit of that comparison with her. She now had the heritage, she had the name, she had the family, she had the pioneer stock, and she also had this wildly intense education that really was terribly unique on the frontier.
And imagine all of those things you've just said, Darren. But one of the things that would have made her unique on that campus at Columbia is just the backbone and toughness of her childhood and her heritage. And most of those students are probably quite privileged and all of that. And she's there standing up with all of them, not only intellectually, but in other ways that most of them probably couldn't have even imagined.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of my favorite stories is when she came up from Bunkerville to a trip to St. George and walked into the drugstore. And all girls like to feel attractive. They want to feel desired. They want to be pretty. That's just a very common thing for a girl, especially to want to be known for. They want to be presentable and attractive and desirable. And for her to walk into that drugstore and be overwhelmed by all of the sights and sounds and smells of this store full of these trappings that
and
were
we're talking about the Dixie drug.
Yeah, right there.
She was at the Tabernacle for some kind of gathering, church gathering, and she walked a half a block down Tabernacle and walked in the drugstore.
And saw the pretty girls sitting at the counter.
So you might want to take it from there, but she basically walked in and was overwhelmed by all these sensations and smells and the stimulus, and she said, I looked and there was one of the most homely girls that I'd ever seen walking towards me. And I sat and wondered, almost like my heart went out to her. I don't know the words, but I was almost embarrassed for her and her very plainness. I think that's a kind way of saying it. But she said, and then I noticed as I moved, she moved. And as I stepped, she stepped. And it didn't take her very long to figure out that she was actually looking at her reflection for the first time. And that a deep epiphany as a young woman, knowing that the world was not going to notice her for her looks. It was part of that instantaneous, deep commitment to know that her mission was not going to be based on anything superficial. She was going to have to offer some depth. And as a young woman, for her to get that through her system with kind of a dramatic and sad experience early on, to leave that behind and not mess with that again and just absolutely take a deep dive where she knew she was going to provide some influence, I think is just awesome and really cute too. And Sharla, you can maybe add to that, or Lyman, you might.
Well, I was just going to say that is, for me, one of the most powerful stories of Dixie I've ever heard. But it is a universal story. It's not just a Dixie story, but Juanita Brooks walking into the drugstore, the same drugstore that we walked into when we were kids, and had that same sense of awe, but we were already introduced to the world. She was seeing herself, her full self, in a mirror for the first time. And that's just it. There's so much to that story. But for me, what's absolutely wonderful is that she shared it, and that she shared it in such an awesome way in her writing. And it stayed with me like no other story. And you shared it so beautifully at the lecture the other night. What a great way to set that up.
Well, and she was very humble her entire life. It was an odd combination. I remember her very well. She was no joke. She was tough. Even when she started to slip mentally, no one messed with her. They just didn't. And Dad told a lot of really fun stories too. He said, Darren, you might see this little old lady over there and not know, but he said we were all going to a dance and I had a white shirt that I wanted ironed because back then you dressed up and you went. And he said, Mom told me that she would iron it, but that I needed to hang it up because it was a chore for her. It took a lot of time, a spray bottle, and they had to get the iron hot on the stove. And it wasn't like you plug it in and iron it. Like it was an ordeal. So Dad said I just naively grabbed the shirt and ran to the dance and had a blast. And I came home and it was late and I threw it on the ground or on the floor and I went about my business. And next time a dance came, I said to Mom, "Will I iron my shirt?" She said, "Absolutely not. I'll never iron another shirt for you ever again." And Dad said, "Mom," and she said, "I told you to take care of that shirt after I ironed it." And she said, "Carl, I mean it. Like, I'm not ironing a shirt for you again." And Dad said she meant it. She never ironed one more shirt as long as he lived. And that was also just part of her saying, look, if I say something, I'm not playing around. Like, I have these pieces in me that you can dance with me, but past a certain point, I have these boundaries and this precision that nobody plays with. And I think those little tiny things, they're fun to talk about. But she needed that when she started diving into her deep work, Mountain Meadows Massacre, John D. Lee, some of those things that were so controversial. She had no room to play around. And her mind was already in that space from just being her. That's the way she was a mom. That's the way she was an intellect. I'm guessing her homework is immaculate. I would love to see some of her grades and papers and comments from the professors. I think that would just be like spectacular. I know I'll never get to see that, but I'm guessing that was all an extension of her authenticity. And a lot of people drive to Southern Utah and they think, wow, it's so beautiful. It's growing so fast. And look at all we've got. The reason I love this series is there are some tall trees that really were the first people to put shovels in here in more ways than one. And to honor them before we get too caught up in the latest development or mall or shopping center or whatever, like it's really critical that we don't lose this heritage of these people that got here first when it wasn't fun and it wasn't air conditioned and it did require a lot of this precision and it wasn't easy. And it required people that were going to die trying to make this go. Yeah, it's a privilege. I can only really be in awe of her now that I'm older because as I grew up, I've lost that. But I remember wondering about how special she was when I walked over and saw my dad. I don't know how old I was, but not very. We were living next door. We tore down Grandma Levitt's house and Mom and Dad built the house that I grew up in. And Dad was taking care of Mom just next door. So he'd go over every single day. Every day. He'd pick her up. He'd scoop her up. He'd take care of her. He'd bathe her. Like he just took excellent care of his mom. And I remember walking in the door of that house and seeing Dad carrying Mom down the hall, just in his arms and joking around with her and talking to her and kissing her on the forehead. And I thought, I don't really know a lot about her now, but there must be something awfully special about her to see my dad be that tender and that attentive to her. That made a huge impact on me. And
I can't help but think about her not ironing his shirts anymore, and yet that is how they ended up together.
You know what's funny about the ironing story? My mom would thank her every day for the rest of her life because growing up, I don't think my mom ever ironed a shirt. My dad ironed every shirt he ever wore for the rest of our lives.
And guess what? I knew your dad really well, and he always had a nicely ironed shirt on.
And you know what's funny is I think he got to where he enjoyed it because if he was doing the ironing, he could watch as much of the sports on TV that he wanted. So my mom, the ironing would get really, and every shirt had to be ironed if you lived in our house. So my dad would get pretty high and he'd plant the ironing board in the living room and he'd iron away, probably thanking his mom eventually for saying, hey, this benefits me now.
That is great.
I like to go back a little bit to not just the drugstore, but some things that I find remarkable, just like that story about her, because people now, they would be beat down by some of the things that she experienced. The I'm ugly, that she never forgot that experience. She thought for the rest of her life she was ugly. But she also was very musical. She played the piano, she played the organ, and she sang until someone in town in Bunkerville said she overheard them saying she couldn't carry a note and she should never sing again. And she never did. But she continued to play the piano and organ. And when she got to Columbia, she had left her child behind with her parents. So she was completely alone. And I'm sure her heart was broken on some level and grateful on another because she knew she wouldn't see her child for a year. And when she started that first semester, she writes about her fear. Now, she was 31 at the time, 28, 30 at the time. So she said, I was the dumbest one in the class. I didn't know. I got into the class and there were so many things I didn't know. And I realized that I may not make it. I may not survive the year. And by the end of the year, she was the top of her class. And she had one dress. Just the story of what she writes about that year and all of the stuff she'd already been through. There's a time in elementary school where she actually got kicked out of school because the teacher said, your child is sick, she's ugly, I cannot stand the sight of her. I want her to go home from school and come back when she's healthier. Whole year out of school. She rode her horse, she stayed away, she listened by the door. She learned as much as she could from listening to her aunt teach. When she went back, she'd skipped a grade. In spite of the teacher saying and that was what he said, I can't stand the sight of her. And he sent her home. And all of those things had to have added up. But here she is back in the bottom of the pile in Columbia and comes out on the top like she did so many times throughout her life.
That is wonderful, the way you share that. I met Juanita once, and it was when I graduated from Dixie College. And it would have been 1977. And you guys, how old were you guys?
I was 10.
You were 10.
I was 8.
You were 8. And that's about the time when she was starting, her decline began. But my dad had enough, just insight or inspiration to know that I needed to meet Juanita Brooks. And he took me up to her outside the old college gym after the graduation. And we talked probably for 5 minutes. And it was like, kind of like you, who's this? Who is this? But then as the years passed, I realized who it was I was talking to. I actually knew it at that moment because my dad always had your grandma on a pedestal. And I know it's because of his father, my grandpa, who taught with her. And when I was in high school and I needed to do a book report, my dad said, do the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The massacre was never something that we didn't talk about in our family, even though we have ancestors who were involved. And part of the reason for that is because Juanita Brooks wrote that book, and we could read that book, and we could gain a sense of context that could not be had just by talking and sharing everybody's opinions or different thoughts. And so my dad, he had known Juanita all his life because he was one of those lucky people who had her as an English teacher. And President Holland, Jeffrey Holland, sat right in this room a few months ago. And one of the things he said was that I had Juanita Brooks as an English teacher. Who has Juanita Brooks as an English teacher? And I think there's just that sense of this amazing woman that we were all privileged enough to interact with. And my dad made it possible for me to interact with her in one instance in my life.
My dad had her as an English teacher, too.
Can I share something?
Yes.
Because I have the program from her funeral. Her funeral was on August 26, 1989, and I was there. And I only made 2 or 3 notes because I was normally I'd probably made a lot more notes, but when your dad spoke, he told that story. But here's what my notes say. Why did you give me a C? Because I didn't want to give you a D. So Carl had his mother for an English teacher, and she gave him a C. And he was pretty upset and wanted to know why. And that was her answer.
Yep. He also had a comment that he finally got his first little job and made a little bit of money and came home and immediately ran down to the drugstore and spent it all on gum and candy and whatever, and came home and was so proud. He showed Mom, so it showed Juanita, Mom, look at everything I got, and how hard he'd worked, and he made some money and spent it all on candy. And she said, Carl, sit down. So he sat down and she said, Carl, I hope you find a way to make a good living with your hands because your mind is not going to be worth much. And Dad said he was pretty young and impressionable, but she meant it. So she talked him through like how frivolous that is to work that hard for trinkets and gum and candy. And Dad said it became, obviously I'm telling that because it's fun, and it was fun for him too. But boy, she told it like she saw it. And this is another really fun story. She was extremely insightful, and she also had a sixth sense about her. And Dad said, this is a story from Dad. So there was a gal that came into her class and was just crying and said, somebody stole my tuition money out of my purse. It was in my coat pocket out in the hallway. And Juanita said, are you sure? And she says, no, I'm sure. I brought my money to pay for school today. And it's gone. Somebody took it. And she said, this gal said, Juanita just sat there for a second and kind of looked at me and said, I'll go find it for you. And so she said she took this little gal and walked down the hall, and she paused in front of the rooms, and she said there's one door. She opened and walked in the middle of the room, and she said, somebody in this room took the tuition money for a student out of a coat pocket in the hallway. I expect you to be in my office in 10 minutes or you'll be expelled and you'll be prosecuted. And she said she closed the door and walked down the hallway. Here came a kid right out of that classroom, came down shaking and crying and confessed, I'm so sorry I did it. Juanita says, all right. They talked it through and got the money back. And that little girl looked at Grandma like, oh my gosh. But yeah, she just had this nose for the truth, and she was in a space in her mind where I kind of really envy the clarity she had during those times in her life where she just knew herself. She knew what she was supposed to do. There wasn't any waffling. There wasn't messing around. I think of the time I've lost by messing around in thoughts or whatever, fantasies or nervousness or insecurities. But I think once she got through, and it's fun to talk about how she developed those things even as a little girl, but it seems like once she kind of hit her stride, she didn't apologize to anybody for any reason because she had already settled those things. I think for me, I wish I could and would have settled those things to the point where I could just live the rest of my life and have those lessons locked forever. It seems like she was able to do that. I swear I still mess around with stuff. I like the lessons that I should have settled, but it seems like when she settled something, she really settled it. And then she just moved on with it. And I just think that's spectacular and it's rare. And it takes those kind of women and men to settle the frontier and build campuses and really move us all into that next space. But anyway, I thought those were some kind of fun stories too.
You brought up your dad, and I can't help but talk. I love your dad. And when I say that I got to meet your grandma right after the graduation ceremony in 1977, that was only made possible by your dad. Because I got home from my mission and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I'd been to Dixie for a short period of time, and I had gotten married, and Debbie had her degree and her teaching degree, and I needed to get on up to BYU if I was really going to do something. And so I needed to get out of Dixie. And I went in to your dad's office, Carl Brooks, vice president at Dixie College, and sat down, and he just started talking to me. And then he said, Lyman, come back tomorrow morning. Let's talk some more. And we talked, I don't know if it was on consecutive days, but for several days, we'd just go in and visit. He wanted to know all about what was going on with me and my family and share stories and talk history. But what we finally needed to do was figure out how I could get my associate degree at Dixie so I could get off, because Debbie had a chance to teach up north. And so I needed that degree. And there was no way I was going to be able to get it in that time period. But Carl Brooks, he didn't cut any corners, but he checked all the boxes. And we got the classes I needed, and we got it all worked out, and I was able to graduate. I've just been forever grateful for that caring about the one and taking care of the one. And again, I'm sure that a lot of that comes from his mom and his dad and from his upbringing. But this whole idea of our heritage and our shared community heritage, your dad shared that with me. He didn't know me from any other young man who had grown up. He knew me, but not any better or in any other way than he would of any other young man. But he took care of me on an individual basis. I think of him as mayor of St. George during those crucial years in the 80s. And when I returned home to St. George in 83 and we started St. George Magazine, and your dad was my greatest champion. And his acknowledgement and his approbation was the most valuable thing I could have had at that moment. And all of that meant so much to me. And it made that difference. And in the way that you've been sharing these stories about Juanita, the different points that make a difference in people's lives. And so I couldn't go any further without sharing that to the two of you. And whenever I talk about your dad, I'm talking about your mom too. Carla, I love her and appreciated her so much. And I know that I can't imagine how much you guys miss them because I know how much I do. And it's just part of that whole Dixie spirit of that and that community, that shared legacy, that shared story that we all have. And Juanita is at the center of that.
Yeah, she is. And we could do a month on Dad, too. Maybe we should sometime because the stories, my mind just explodes with Carl Brooks stories. So
that's the point I'm making here. We need a Carl Brooks episode, and we're gonna plan to do that.
Juanita, she was such a good mother. Her kids tell so many stories about the kind of mother she was. That really, Uncle Claire finds a bird nest, and she teaches them all about birds. And she was a stepmother and a mother to all these boys. And she canned 100 peaches in one day and wrote all night. People always say, how in the world did she do what she did? And the only answer is I don't think she slept very much, for one, because she couldn't have. And there's some really funny stories about my dad, because Aunt Willa was first, and she'd always wanted a girl. And when she got pregnant very quickly after, they're only less than 18 months apart, close together, she told everybody it was another girl. And she was convinced it was another girl, and she was having another girl, and then my dad was born. And she wouldn't accept it. So she dressed him in dresses, and she let his hair grow out, and she curled it in ringlets. And her dad came up one day, and he said, "You stop this. You will thank the Lord every day for the rest of your life for that son." And eventually, Grandpa Brooks took him down and cut his hair without telling her. Only time he ever did anything against her will, according to the boys. And all the family cheered. They were so grateful to have their brother look like a brother. But that relationship, another story about my dad, to show how busy she was, when he was a newborn, she woke up in the middle of the night, and it was time for the middle of the night feeding, and she reaches over and she said, "Will, where's the baby?" Wakes him up. She said, "I don't know where the baby is." She sat up, and then she remembered the last time she'd seen him was in the afternoon. She left him outside under the tree in a little bed. And this was 2 o'clock in the morning. She went out. He was still there. He was outside on the front lawn, sound asleep. And I thought, she must have been so busy. She had older children and younger children, and she was working. My dad was born in 1935, so she was gathering histories and feeling pressure. She was working on Jacob Hamlin until her dad told her to stop working on Jacob Hamlin. And she was still having babies, and they were running a farm in Hurricane. And another thing I think is interesting is she did not drive until she was 71. She didn't have a driver's license until she turned 71. The only reason she drove then is because Will had to stop driving. But she rode the night bus everywhere she went. So throughout her writing, or written about her, it will say she got on the night bus. She went to California on the night bus. She went to Salt Lake on the night bus. And in Levi Peterson's book, he actually says she always hoped that nobody would be there. She could have 2 seats to herself and actually get some sleep. But she must have been able to get along on very little sleep to accomplish all of the regular chores plus the writing in the middle of the day.
And that's what's so amazing, Sharla, is that through all those years, she was on the State Board of History, and that's when she was riding that night bus to Salt Lake a lot, along with other things. And then the work at the Huntington Library in California on that night bus. And all of these things that are really transcendent. But this is a woman with kids in St. George, Utah, trying to raise a family and doing these amazing things.
When people ask if the covering the typewriter with ironing is a true thing, and that's a true thing, she found it annoying when people called on her and interrupted her work. So that's the way she figured it out, is if people came in, she'd iron, she'd busy, she'd talk to them, and then in her letters to other people, she would say, I'm interrupted and I just want to get back to my work. But she used that ironing as a way to get something done if people came to visit her.
And there she is ironing in her humble home in St. George, and she's corresponding with some of the most important historians throughout the country. We could start naming names, but she was known and admired and sought out by so many notable people.
Yeah, and church officials as well. It hasn't been that long. We were digging through a trunk across the street from her home and pulled out a letter that she had written to one of the general authorities. I don't remember which one it was. Was it
There were several.
Heber J. Grant? So the letter, so back then the paper was so important and expensive that if you got a letter and the back was blank, then you'd write your letter on the back and send it back. So that's how they corresponded. And the front of the letter that we found was like a veiled threat from one of the general authorities. I think it was Heber J. Grant. I could be wrong. But the letter basically says, Juanita, there are some very concerning things about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and listed a few of those in the letter, and was encouraging her to stop that sensationalism and to not damage the church on hearsay, et cetera. And she took that letter and flipped it over and wrote back. And it's so fun. It was so fun to read. She said, if you had actually read the book, the things that you're concerned about, you would not be concerned about. There are far more concerning things in the book than the ones you cited. So I suggest you actually read the book and then get back to me on the things that you should be concerned about. And sure enough, there's another letter. Here it comes. Juanita, you're right. I did not read the book, but now that I have read the book, but she just firing stuff back and forth, and it was great fun to go through. Those are all over at the university, correct? But yeah, it was as she read that, she goes, I can tell you didn't read it. And that ended up being her saving grace, was people finally had to read it. They had to read all of her stuff before they criticized. And certainly she would not tolerate the criticism based on hearsay. She didn't mind the criticism based on facts and actuality. She stood up to all of that. But what she didn't was when people would come and patronize or criticize, not knowing the truth. So that was and that was a general authority at the church. That was a somebody, and she just fired right back. You obviously hadn't read it, because if you had, these wouldn't be your maiden. This certainly is not the worst part of the book. Yeah, she just persisted in that until the end. And she did really start to slip mentally. And I think I told this at the opening of the lecture series, but she remembered Dad really only. I think Dad's the only person she remembered really until she passed. Everybody else was forgotten, certainly me. And close to the end of her life, Dad went down, held her hand, and put her teeth in and was talking to her. And Mom looked at Dad and said, "What's wrong with me?" And Dad said, "Mom, you have Alzheimer's. You can't remember things like you used to." And she said, "What's Alzheimer's?" He said, "Mom, it's a disease where it takes your memory and it really hurts your mind." But she goes, "I know you, Carl." And I know you, Mom. And then she sat there for a second longer and she said, "Carl, I wondered why I was meeting new people every day." And Dad said, boy, he just roared, and she giggled. And she was looking at herself again at the end of her life, in that mirror, recognizing, like even at the end, that she was seeing some things that weren't necessarily savory, but she was also acknowledging them. And even on her way out, on her way to that final graduation, she's, I still am willing to see this. I still am willing to see myself. I'm still not embarrassed. I'm still okay. I'm going to play with this son. But Dad loved that story.
Sharla, you guys, you and Darren and your family, and I assume others, are doing some amazing things right now to really perpetuate the legacy of Juanita Brooks. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, we hope to. We started the Juanita Brooks Historical Preservation Society, nonprofit organization, with that in mind, with the desire to perpetuate her legacy and make sure that we do the kind of work that would honor her legacy. And it came about because our youngest brother had an idea about saving her house when my mom died. He said, hey, we should save Juanita's house. There's someone living there now, but we should try and buy it back and turn it into a museum. And I don't think we had any idea when we all thought, oh, yeah, that's a great idea, what it would lead to. So fast forward to now, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been one of our great supporters. They donated all of the money to buy Juanita's house and our parents' house, and they've made the possibility of her house becoming a museum a reality. So that's one of our long-term goals. And in the meantime, we are sponsoring some projects that we really feel like Juanita would have championed. One of those is the Short Creek Heritage Project. Juanita wrote extensively about the 1953 raids in Short Creek, where some children were taken out of their home, the home of Vera Black. She was very opposed to it. And we've had a couple of grants given to us so we can go into Short Creek. We actually have someone living there who's gathering the history of Short Creek. And I really feel like Juanita would be proud of that. And to represent the marginalized society over there that has often been sensationalized, but never accurately represented. And so we're really trying to work with them, and some really great things are happening. They're wanting to tell their story, but they want to tell it to someone they can trust. What's so remarkable is they all know Juanita over there. Everybody remembers those raids. Everybody remembers that she was their friend. And that's allowed us, where they haven't allowed other people in, that has allowed us to come in and really tell their truth. Not our version of it, but their version of it. So we're really excited about that. We've got a couple of other projects. We've got some really great partners with the Santa Clara Historical Society, the Washington City Historical Society, the Washington County Historical Society. We've all been able to talk together and learn from each other, and we really enjoy our association in the community with other societies around us. And I think one thing about Juanita's legacy, and my dad's as well, is they were bridge builders, and we really want to be that as we prepare for the museum to open. We really want to be that for the community. And all the historical societies, we share the same history. So we really want to make sure that we share that with everybody else and work together as we do that. My parents' house will be torn down and turned into an interpretive center. The city has some really great plans for that. And people ask all the time, are you sad about your parents' house coming down? And I said, the history of that property, Juanita owned that property first, and she lived in it with her son, Ernie. And then she moved her mother in when she married Will. Long before she married and knew the Brooks family, she owned that property. And then she gave it to my dad, and he tore that house down. So I really feel like my parents are saying, we did that once to make something better, and they're applauding the fact that we can do it again and make something better again that will honor the family legacy, including perpetuating not just Juanita's stories, but her scholarship. Have it be a place where people can, our vision is for someone to come in and say, I think I have ancestors here. For us to be able to say, how are you related? Tell us your name. Who do you think it is? We can pull up their name and we can say, this is where they lived. You can go down and see their original location. Maybe the house is gone, but this is where they lived. If you want to go see their cemetery plot, this is where it is. If you want to learn more about them, here's a one-page history of them, and here's a picture of them. So they can not just learn about the history of Southern Utah, but maybe they can make a personal connection to their history when they walk into the museum while they learn about Southern Utah. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to not just celebrate those that have gone before, but we want to celebrate those that are with us now. And we are working on a really fun project with Ralph, Jerry Atkin, and the Atkin family. And we're really excited about that. And the Atkins were some of the earliest. They came down with the Perrys and the Brookses in that second or third wave, and they have been great contributors to the community. So they're allowing us to let us work with them and tell the Atkins story as it's moved all the way through Sky West, all the way to now. We're having a lot of fun with Ralph, and we're having a lot of fun with Jerry. So we look forward to more good things like that to come.
This is all so phenomenal. It's just so great what you're doing. And you just carry that same spirit of your grandma and are doing it in such an excellent way, just the way she would do it. Congratulations on all that you've done to this point, and excited about all that you're planning and all that you're doing.
Thanks. I also, and Sharla mentioned this as well, but Barton, our younger brother, he just came out of the woodwork after Mom passed and ended up with this. We were thinking about selling the house. But he really catalyzed that vision and thought, what if we did something really special for the community? And started knocking doors and flew out from New York. And I hadn't really seen him that excited about anything St. George or Heritage for years. But something, maybe the spirit of Juanita or Dad or both or Mom or all three, he really seemed like that passion came into him and through him. And he's got a huge history of philanthropy and helping people donate to great causes. He's done a lot of stuff all over the world. But yeah, he's really the one that kind of lit that up. And Sharla, all to her credit, she's taken that. Bart took off on a round-the-world trip not long after he'd lit this big fire. And Sharla, since then, she's taken the reins and is really working through all of this next phase of this project. But I was really impressed with Bart not knowing I'll say it because I love him and we talk pretty candidly, but I didn't really think that it would come from him. I thought it might come from somebody else, but it came from Bart. I thought that was pretty cool. And we all lifted an eyebrow. Whoa, that's a great idea. And so it's fun to piggyback off of that. But that heritage, I'm telling you, you never really know how much you ingest as you grow up until it's needed. And I think that's the fun thing about heritage is you don't have to shout it your entire life, but when it's needed, and I think that's what's fun about Bart and Sharla now taking that on, it's fun to see that when the times a lot of what might have seemed to have been passing over or through really did stick. And so when something important needs to be done, then those things light up and man, here it goes. And then the heritage gets to continue. So I want just a huge shout out to both Bart and Sharla for moving this forward.
It's awesome. I think what we've been defining here for this whole hour is the spirit of Dixie and that spirit that your dad just embodied perhaps more than in a way that no one else has ever. But you talk about Bart, that spirit of Dixie's in his DNA, and all of that is part of what makes all this happen.
You can't help it. Dad used to say, be careful, you get that red dirt in your shoes. It's never coming out, and that's just.
But you guys grew up right up there in the red dirt
We grew up we were in Grandma's basement for the first few years. She lived upstairs and we lived downstairs, and Mom, of course, did not like that at all. And so once they tore great-grandma Levitt's house down and started to build, that was a happier time for Mom. But we lived literally like under her feet, like growing up.
And right under the Sugarloaf, we could all see the Sugarloaf from our bedroom windows.
Yeah. Strikes me also that you're in the same neighborhood with Doc Booth.
Exactly. Doc Booth around the corner. Yeah.
And the Staleys, and there was a lot.
How did you deal with that?
The Booths were our friend. Darren and Berkeley, same age. And, of course, Doc Booth was everybody's friend, and my dad was everybody's friend. And they did lots of travel together with Ralph Atkin and Ross Hurst. But Doc Booth, I hope I can share this without getting too emotional, but one of my favorite memories, least favorite, but greatest blessings of being associated with Dr. Booth was at the basketball game when I was there and my husband was there, and we were sitting with my dad and my mom. My dad was one row behind us, and my mom and Paul and I were sitting in front. And someone came up to shake my dad's hand, and he didn't move his arm. And it was so unlike my dad. He would have stood up and give someone a hug, shook their hand. Never, ever had I seen anything like my dad look at someone and not raise a hand. And I turned to my mom and I said, I think something's wrong with Dad. Turned around, and my dad just looked terrified. My husband got up. We knew exactly where Dr. Booth was. He was right at the bottom of the arena, in his same seat where he always sat at those basketball games. He ran up. He got my dad out, and my dad was having a stroke. But Dr. Booth was there, and he saved him. because it was the kind of stroke that it was a hemorrhage in the back of his neck. So my husband went with him to the hospital, and we sat there and waited while Dr. Booth cared for my dad and got him on a life flight. And I will never forget the comfort that I had sitting there, knowing that Dr. Booth was right where we knew he needed to be for us, never knowing that we needed him there. And then his response and his care. And it was late into the night before he came out and told us what was happening, but he stayed the whole time. And that was a hallmark of Dr. Booth. That's what he did for everybody. But the day when we needed him, he was there for us too. And I'll be forever grateful for that experience. It's still so vivid in my memory. And Dr. Booth was there when we needed him the most. So grateful.
Yeah, it was awesome. I was at that game too, and I don't mean to lighten up a heavy situation, but I think the referees for the opposing team were also happy that Dr. Booth left the stadium because he was a passionate Dixieite, and boy, any opposing official also knew Dr. Booth.
That's probably true. That's true.
But yeah, I agree, and I think that community back, I'm talking like I'm old, I guess I'm getting there, but back in those days, the community was so tight-knit and such dear friends. They didn't all agree, for sure. My dad was a Democrat. Good grief. Talk about inviting opposition. But they just loved each other.
So was Juanita.
Yeah. they just loved each other. They really did. And that community was built on that. Anything, anytime. I mean, somebody needed a blessing, they'd call, we'd call. Everybody took care of everybody back then. And the Dixie spirit really was like, we're all living here together. My mom would open the door on a summer morning and wouldn't expect me back, sometimes for a day or two. I'd end up staying over at Berkeley's house. I'd end up on the snows floor. We'd wander back in and grab another sandwich. But literally the community raised us kids. That whole Red Hill raised all of us. And those times are long gone, right? No, never a locked door, keys in every car. And that's how the community was built. It was built on total trust, pure love, lots of service, lots of heaviness, and lots of work. And Dad, too, he embodied that. We always had somebody staying in our dang basement growing up, always. Somebody picked up at the bus stop, someone at college needed a place to stay. We had people living in our house all the time. And
Thanksgiving was never just us. It was...
And Dad just, oh, yeah, of course. And Mom would just roll her eyes like, Carl, can we just have a family dinner? I'm telling you, there was always a stranger wandering around our house. They'd be in the shower. Mom would be doing their laundry. They'd be up for dinner, and they'd be kind of sheepish. And Dad, oh, gosh, he'd act like he'd knew him forever and just loved him to pieces. And the stories from some of those strangers that came back when Dad passed were really special. He really would not allow you to not feel wanted or included. He wouldn't allow it. In 15 seconds, he'd have you snuggled up and tell you how amazing you were and how great you looked and how much confidence he had in you. And it was just, but again, that Dixie spirit you're talking about, that was just infectious back
What
then.
you're expressing, Darren, is exactly what I experienced personally.
And it's what Juanita did as well. Every single one of her siblings that showed up at their house stayed as long as they wanted, days, weeks, were fed the whole time in the middle of everything she had going on. Aunt Willa was annoyed. She couldn't understand how her family took such advantage of her. Her family never felt at one time. They were always welcome, always for days, always provided with whatever they needed, including wedding dresses and receptions and food for her siblings. She cared for all of them in a remarkable way.
A little bit of money. There's a town transient. Did you ever know Smokey Lyman?
Of course.
Everybody
Lyman
knows it.
actually has an episode about Smokey Lyman.
I visited with him in the city park many times. I considered him a friend.
Dad, he would walk up the street and you'd always knew, here comes Smokey, and he'd knock on the door. And always there, you knew Smokey. That's just the way he was, just him. Mom would open the door. Oh, Carl. When Dad would come out, Mom would say, Smokey, we don't have any money. Smokey would say, Brooks always got some money for Smoke. He'd sit there, and sure enough, Dad would come out and give him a little money or feed him or whatever. But everybody knew they could come to Dad for whatever they needed, especially like a hug and a warm heart and a place to land. It was really tricky to be his son, though, in the house. I don't know how Sharla feels about this, but he was so concerned with everybody else and everybody else's problems that occasionally it was really hard to track him down as my dad. Like, he was the dad of St. George. I understood that, and I love hearing all the stories, but sometimes I'd miss him as mine. And that was really tricky growing up because I felt pretty neglected sometimes while he was out saving the whole community. And it's taken me years, and even now there's twinges of that. But looking back, his mission really was the one. And sometimes I wasn't that one. Somebody else was. And I didn't like that because I felt like I should be the one regularly. And maybe I should have more often. He probably would agree with that. But he really did seek out everyone and anyone who needed anything, anytime, day or night. And Sharla says the same. Like, he learned that growing up with Juanita. To bring this back, that all started, that whole movement. And heaven forbid we should lose it, but that whole Southern Utah movement and culture started with a few people who were relentlessly dedicated, incredibly faithful, very loving, and really were committed to making this area and community spectacular. And she's one of those. She just absolutely is.
Darren, you have expressed that so beautifully. And Sharla, you as well.
Before we're done, can I share two of my favorite quotes?
Would you please?
Yes. These two things I think are what embody her. The first one is her own words, where she says, "I don't believe anything but the truth is good enough for the church to which I belong." That, she lived by that, telling the truth. And that embodied everything she ever published, ever wrote. The other one was something that was said about her, and it said, she was an uncommon woman dressed in a very common exterior. And both of those, I feel like, represent what she lived and who she was, as well as anything.
I'm just going to play off that one more comment. I think we need now, in this day and age, 2025 more than ever, to realize that legacies are made with doing the basics really well. All of the glitz and flower and glitter and all of that doesn't leave marks and legacies. Like just picking good, solid, base, fundamental pieces and doing them exceptionally well. And that's why we're talking about Juanita. And I think anything that we could do to infuse that more into our society, I think would be awesome. And I think she just embodied that.
I'm looking at this funeral service program again as we close here. And we started talking about Columbia and that moment when the clarion bells on the campus, she heard "Lead Kindly Light." And that was a really important moment in her life. And I just noticed here that the opening hymn at her funeral service was "Lead Kindly Light," led by Howard Putnam and accompanied by Martine Putnam. There's so much more we could talk about here, but thank you. This has been just a precious hour. And the two of you reflect, you carry on, you are that same legacy of your grandma. And we express our love to you. We express our best wishes as this Juanita Brooks Society moves forward and all of the awesome plans that you have.
Thanks, Lyman. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. all around me and take away my breath.